Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to, hi, Adam. Welcome to this interview with Leas Krivchenia of Nonviolent Peaceforce. She's recently returned from her work in South Sudan as program manager for NP. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Nonviolent Peaceforce, I will read you their one-sentence explanation of their incredible work and then invite Leah to give us a little more of an in-depth explanation of what they do. This is how they describe themselves. Nonviolent Peaceforce promotes, develops, and implements unarmed civilian peacekeeping as a tool for reducing violence and protecting civilians in situations of violent conflict. So we at Raven and at Teaching Nonviolent Atonement have been captivated by Nonviolent Peaceforce for years because of the way they implement methodologies of civilian protection using nonviolence in conflict zones. So Leah, if you could give a little more information for folks about what NP does and how they intervene in violent situations.
Sure. So I've worked with Nonviolent Peaceforce in the field in both Sri Lanka and South Sudan over the last 4 to 5 years. So we are an international NGO that, as you said, in our one-sentence mandate, uses unarmed civilian peacekeeping as a tool to reduce violence and protect civilians. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping is a sort of toolbox, so to speak, of various techniques and methods that civilians can use in a sort of in violent conflicts or post-conflict scenarios to decrease violence that is affecting civilians. So as most people know, armed peacekeeping or military peacekeeping uses violence as a way to reduce other kinds of violence. So the premise is strict deterrence through the threat of violence from a peacekeeping force. What we do is a little bit different, though we share many of the same goals as military peacekeeping, is that we send civilians into these places. So we operate on a grassroots level. We have teams based in the field in areas where there is current conflict or recurring conflict, teams made up of international and locally hired staff, so mixed teams that go in and use a number of different tools to reduce violence in those areas. So some of the work that we do is focused on direct protection. So we use the concept of international protective presence or protective presence in general, which is a sort of direct protection activity that can be used to keep people safe through the use of international actors' physical presence, essentially. I mean, it's on the one hand very simple and on the other hand quite complicated, but the basic idea is that international presence can make people safer. So whether you are accompanying people as they're moving in a place that they're vulnerable in, or one of the things that we've done quite a bit in South Sudan is doing daily patrols through areas where civilians are vulnerable. So a daily presence of our team and of our staff that does actually, we've seen it deter violence in these areas. We've seen it make people feel more safe and made the number of incidents of violence in those areas go down. So we do that kind of direct violence. We do also a lot of sort of community-based protection work. So a lot of the work that we're doing is about working with community members, empowering them to take control of their own security and their own protection, and support them in reinforcing or building or recreating protection mechanisms that they can use to keep their communities safe. So a lot of times these are protective mechanisms that have been used in the past or that are used to some extent that we reinforce and support and make stronger. One of the things that we find is that communities do have these. People know how to protect themselves. People have ideas, but if you're in a situation or have been in a situation of a lot of violence for a long time, or of displacement, or of great poverty, that these structures tend to break down, and communities often lose some of the things that they might have had in the past. So a lot of our role is to come in to sort of spend the time to work to support them to rebuild a lot of these things. So we do the work through a number of different ways. One of the main ways, and I think one of our main added values, is that we do work from a grassroots perspective. We have teams that are permanently based in very remote locations, sometimes fairly insecure locations, and who are there, who are living with the community, which gives us an understanding of the conflict dynamics that is very difficult to get if you're moving in and out of these places. So I think this has really allowed us to tailor our interventions in very specific ways. So we're able to work directly with community members, we're able to work directly with security forces in the area, with civil society actors in the area to address the very specific protection issues that people have. So it's not just about sort of general protection issues, it's about what might happen tomorrow, what might happen next week, what are the very concrete things that we can work with you on. One of the other sort of main ideas or premises of the work that we do is through creating nonpartisanship, doing nonpartisanship. Think about it as a verb is how I like to think about it. And sort of the idea is that, you know, we want to be seen as a nonpartisan actor. We want to be seen as somebody who everybody is happy to work with. The way that we do that is through active relationship building with all parties on the ground. So that includes conflict parties, that includes communities, that includes government structures, NGOs, military, non-state armed actors, everyone. So it's the active nonpartisanship and making sure that we are known to people, we have an understanding of where everyone is coming from, adds to our understanding of the context, and it means that we can potentially influence those actors. So like I said, it's a bottom-up approach, and I think the things that I've seen to be really effective are things that have happened because we're based in communities, because we understand what's happening. Communities trust us enough to talk to us about the issues in their community, and I have absolutely seen some of the impact that we've been able to have in reducing violence in these areas.
That's
wow, okay.
So before we move on, I want to point out that our good friend Tim Seitz Brown is joined us by phone.
Oh, Tim,
Tim, can you hear us? Tim, welcome to the call, and we'll try to work on getting you. Oh, yeah, on iPad. Okay. We should be able to see you. Okay, we'll try to get that figured out. So, Suzanne, you were going to ask a question, but if I can jump in, you can hold on to that. So, Leah, can you give us a little bit of the historical background of South Sudan?
Sure. So South Sudan is the newest country in the world, gained independence just a little over 2 years ago, and NP has been in the country since about 1.5 years before independence, I think. So there was a sort of decades-long civil war between the north, what is now Sudan, and what is now South Sudan, as well as sort of within that, as there usually are within civil wars, a lot of sort of internal fighting among the various sides. So it's, you know, a little bit more complicated than just the two sides against each other. But the sort of the armed group in the south really grew, really developed, had a political wing, but also engaged in quite a bit of military action. So over the last few decades in South Sudan, there's been immense active violence as well as a lot of displacement. So one of the big things that has happened is that communities have really had to flee back and forth. There were quite a few refugees, both in neighboring countries and moving to places like the US and the UK. So the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed in 2005. That set the path towards independence. There was a referendum in 2011 where independence was voted for and then became passed in July 2011. So yeah, so it's the newest country in the world. It's obviously dealing with a lot of issues that come out from that. I mean, things that you've never thought of, how to put a country together. So there's just a lot of sort of state building that has to happen, and that the South Sudanese people are doing right now. Sort of the issues that we're working on right now. So there's still conflict on the border. There's a lot going on at the political level with that, but also quite a bit of conflict on the ground, where the border has not quite been set up yet, as well as sort of changes to migration patterns. So there's sort of issues with different nomadic groups moving in and out of each other's territories, as well as there's fighting across the border that is sort of spilling over into South Sudan, so more sort of internal fighting. A lot of the other issues that we're dealing with are sort of internal conflicts within South Sudan. So since the peace agreement, you know, as the sort of big conflict has gone down, a lot of these littler conflicts have come up, and so a lot of them are also quite historically rooted. As the South sort of struggled against the North, there was also a lot of internal factions and fighting within that. So some of that continues. A lot of it is resource-based, so there's sort of, issues over cattle grazing land and water and roads and all of that. Some of it is sort of, what can be called intertribal conflicts, so different tribal groups, which is historically based as well as based on things like resources and politics and representation and governance and all of that. So yeah, so there's that. I mean, I think, there's a lot going on the political level. Constitutions are being written, and elections are coming in the next few years. This is not really the area that we work, but you can see it sort of trickle down. So it's you can't totally separate what's happening at the national political level with how it's playing out in communities in conflict, because they're very much connected. So we're dealing with a really broad variety of conflicts. So some of the areas that we work in, we're dealing with issues of armed groups. So we work in LRA-affected communities. We work in areas where there's active militia groups and counterinsurgency campaigns. We work in areas where there's fighting across the border that is coming over. We do a lot of conflict mitigation work, communities that are fighting over grazing routes or sort of cattle raiding issues that erupt into violence, sort of working in areas where there's sort of more political violence in terms of issues with the state and non-state armed actors. It's a really broad range, often many at once. So it's very complicated. I mean, I think it's a really challenging context because there are so many different things happening at a regional and a national and a local level. So part of the challenge is just sort of figuring out what all of these dynamics are in the first place.
Leah, I would like to hear a little bit about your personal history, I guess, and how you got into Nonviolent Peaceforce.
Sure. So I've been with NP now for almost 5 years. I actually started out, I went to Sri Lanka on a Fulbright. I was there initially doing research on international NGOs and in the conflict area and sort of the different dynamics of that. I sort of ran into NP. I had heard of the organization and was interested in the work they were doing. I had been in college really interested in conflict and done some mediation work and was sort of interested in a lot of these same ideas about violence and how can we deal with violence. And then sort of ran into NP, and the rest is history. So I mean, I've been with NP for pretty much all of my professional life at this point. So it's been great to be able to see the work in different contexts. That's been something that's been really valuable for me. I feel as though that, because conflict looks really different in different places, and violence looks really different in different places. And so being able to see what we were able to do in Sri Lanka, being able to see what we've been able to do in South Sudan. I've also done some work in the head office, so having a little bit of a broader sense, to me has really shown that I think that unarmed civilian peacekeeping can be effective in a really broad variety of contexts, but it's going to look really different in those different places, which again just speaks to sort of the importance of understanding the local context. But I think the countries that we work in all are very different, which to me sort of speaks to the broad applicability of the tool of unarmed civilian peacekeeping.
So what have you observed about violence and about, I mean, can you make some general statements about violence, and also how does it show up in different ways in different places?
So I think
but it's the question we're most interested in. We are theorists of violence.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot of similarities in what happens. I think that the difference is that sort of violence works through varying community structures. So because those structures are different, community structures, political structures, cultural structures, all of those things are different. The way that violence happens sort of takes different shapes. Which for us, in looking at how to counter that means that the way that we interact has to take really different shapes. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, we did a lot of work through civil society organizations. What that meant in Sri Lanka, I mean, Sri Lanka has a centuries-long history of civil society. There's been an incredibly strong civil society there for many, many years that's been doing a lot of peace work, that's been doing a lot of political work, all sorts of things. So there were a lot of NGOs that we worked with that were providing a lot of services, that were doing their own peace work, that we really played a supportive role. We were able to work on security and protection issues. We were able to pass cases back and forth, but you're coming into something that we would recognize very clearly as an established civil society. South Sudan's history has been really different. So the development has been really different, the sort of political development and military development, for lack of a better term, has been really different. So there are many, many fewer actual organizations. It's very rural. You can't do networking in the same way. The communications infrastructure is really different. And so, a lot of people will sort of look at that and say that there's not a civil society, but what we find is that we work through counterparts. We work with the chief system, which is connected to the government, but also very closely connected to the people. It's sort of an interesting system all to itself. So we do a lot of work with the chiefs. We do a lot of work with sort of self-identified women's leaders or self-identified youth leaders. And so that has sort of taken the role of the local NGOs that we would work with in Sri Lanka. And so being able to sort of change the way that you do that in different cultural contexts has been really important.
So so how you would intervene then becomes very specific to the culture.
Because what we're really looking at is influence. So who can we influence? What we really want to do is prevent violence. We work on a model where we do response to violence as well as prevention, and the prevention piece is the thing that's missing from a lot of different activities, and we really try to do. We think it's really important to do both, but to prevent it, you really need to know who to influence, and so understanding these local structures and local power mechanisms is really important, because the question is who is going to be able to influence that actor, who's going to be able to make that actor be less violent, who is going to be able to, change the outcome of this scenario. And so understanding that is really crucial.
Well, when you're talking about intervening in violent situations, in terms of providing protection for vulnerable people, instinctively, when we feel threatened by violence, we think the way to protect ourselves is to arm ourselves, right? So, hey, you're talking to Americans here. That's what we do best, right?
Yep.
Stand your ground and all of this. So can you explain how protection can be provided by a nonviolent person?
Yep. So it really is all about influence. So the way that we work, there's a couple different dynamics at play. So say we're doing an accompaniment of a group of people who is wanting to move to a different location and is vulnerable from violence from some armed actor along the way, sort of the most general possible scenario. So there's a number of different things. One, the sort of concept of international presence is that as an international person, we're not party to the conflict. So we're coming in from the outside. We're not seen as on one side or the other, which gives us a little bit more security. It gives us a little bit more protection. It gives us the ability to sort of intervene and say, hey, we're not involved in this. Another piece is that as an international organization, whether or not you're talking about our international staff or national staff, we are connected in ways that other people are not. So we're connected. We can be connected to the government. We have access to higher levels of international agencies. We have access to higher levels of government. We have access to, just many, many more things. And so we have the ability to reach above whoever it is that we're dealing with on the ground. Now, this is where the relationship building comes in. So just because we have easier access doesn't mean that we have, unimpeded access. And that's where building this kind of relationships is really important. So our teams on the ground really focus on working with authorities of all kinds, so that means civil authorities as well as various military authorities as well as police, non-state armed actors as well. So if there are those in a particular area, as well as sort of religious leaders or community leaders as the more fuzzy influencers. So if something does happen that we are able to say, well, actually, let me call this person and see if we can talk to them. Let me call the commander. We've spoken with him. He knows that we're coming. We have permission to be here. And so it's laying all of that groundwork and being able to sort of, instead of using force, you're using influence. And whether that influence is sort of pushing or persuasive, there's different ways to do it and sort of different ways to do it on a personal level. We were talking about this earlier, that everybody sort of has their own mode of engagement, and different people are able to sort of pull on different things that might connect them to people, because one of the ways that we think about it is that everybody who we're engaging with, whether you're a potential perpetrator, whether you're a potential victim, whether you're a bystander, it's a person, and you have your own history, you have your own ideas, you have your own beliefs, and that there are ways to connect interpersonally that can interrupt some of the more structural things that are happening.
I know you're working at very local grassroots levels, but I can't help but make applications in my mind to big international things when I think about the United States trying to broker peace between Palestinians and Israel. And when you talk about being nonpartisan, I mean, clearly the U.S. can't pretend that we try to pretend that we're nonpartisan, but the suspicion that we have an agenda that's behind our so-called,
It's very difficult for governments to be nonpartisan.
Yeah.
And this is why this is why we identify as a part of international civil society. So we have international staff from all over the world. Mixed teams is really important. This is why we really make an effort to have people from all over the world, partly just because you bring in a lot of really different and important experience, but because you're also, presenting as a collective representation of civil society as opposed to representing any particular interest.
Because you were saying trust is at the foundation of what you do.
Absolutely. Trust is really important. And I think, if we didn't have, I've seen this in really concrete ways. If we didn't have the trust of particular actors, we would not be able to do what we do effectively. And that's why our team living and working in these communities regularly is really important, because I've seen groups try to come in and do similar things, and if you don't already have those relationships, it's very difficult. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's very difficult.
Tim has a question in the chat that applies to this. Can you hear me?
Oh, good. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. So that applies to kind of this trust building, but his question is a lot of our audience are pastors, people working in a church, and he's questioning how this can work in his context. So I'll read his question. How might this apply in a local congregation context? How might I, as a pastor, fund the imagination of Christians to see the effectiveness/power of nonviolence? Any resources or training you might suggest for, quote, ordinary people? So it's just easy to hear, like, people who are like yourself who are doing these incredibly amazing things, and how do we take what you're doing into our family lives, into our communities, and into our churches, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm having a hard time coming up with resources or anything specific. I think one of the challenges is that, some of this it's not new. None of what we're doing is new, but I think it's only very recently that it's begun to be sort of codified and articulated. So that can be a
Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, Leah, I think I missed like the last 30 seconds.
Okay. I'll try to be in what we're doing or not. I think a lot of these things are actually quite.
Try to start that over again.
So a lot of what we're doing, I think, are quite.
Let's switch.
Recently that elements have started to be codified. And for us, to go into a new context, we find that bring all of the lessons that we have from the work that we've done before, but there are often new things that come about that we've been able to say, actually, this new model of protective presence works really well here, and so now let's look at it. Maybe we can bring it back to other places. So there's.
Sorry, Leah. Can you hear us, Adam?
Yeah, it was chopping in and out for like the first 30 seconds that you were talking, Leah, but now you're good.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's related to a lot of sort of, conflict resolution, conflict transformation ideas, looking at sort of the root cause of things. I guess the difference is that we're really looking at direct violence, and so I don't know. I guess I don't really know in a congregational context.
Well, you know what strikes me is that one thing that happens a lot in congregations is rumors and triangulating and people forming camps. And when you were talking, could you talk a little bit about rumor control and how you do that? Because I think that would apply.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing that we see quite frequently is that bad information can be a huge conflict driver. It's not necessarily going to start something where there isn't anything, but that I think coming back to trust a lot is that people react to bad information and can respond violently. So what we see a lot is reports of an attack will launch a revenge attack before anything is actually corroborated, or will launch a displacement. People will flee because they think an attack is coming, which is an understandable reaction, but obviously something that can be very difficult for communities. And so I think one of the things that we try to do is, again, as a sort of outside actor, it is often easier for us to triangulate this information. We can talk to various people. We can get sort of different sides of the story, which can be really difficult if you're involved in it, to try to bring together all of this information, analyze this information, and make our best understanding of what is actually happening. So again, our model is sort of as an outsider coming in. So that will be quite difficult, I think, to apply in a congregation because people have perspectives. So I think transparency is really important. This is something that we found to be really key, is that sort of open sharing of information in all directions. Making sure that the sort of, this is maybe something that is even more analogous is one of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis is how do we work in intercultural environments. So even among teams, you have a team of 10 people are from 7 different countries, and have an age range of 20 years, and so are coming at the work from really different perspectives. And so one of the things that I tell teams a lot is that we need to make sure that we're giving each other the benefit of the doubt. So if you have a misunderstanding, the first thing that you should be thinking is, okay, it's not, well, that person was, trying to be mean. It's, okay, well, what could they have been trying to do? Like, what could they have been trying to say, or just to ask? And so I think this is true on a community level as well, but on an interpersonal level, just by starting to sort of say, well, are we giving each other the benefit of the doubt in sort of opening ourselves up to misunderstanding? Is that something that we're engaging in on a regular basis?
Right. And as you were saying earlier, we were talking about nobody, even actors that are using violence, no one ever says, oh yeah, I meant to kill a civilian, or I meant to, make someone homeless.
Right.
So you can appeal in a sense. You can make a direct appeal.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a common ground. And this is what we use our sort of opener, particularly, in working with stakeholders that might be a little bit innately suspicious. So military actors are often a little bit suspicious because they're like, well, what do you mean you're working on security? That's our job. Say, well, of course that's your job. We're hoping to support you in that. We're hoping to work together. We are working towards the same goals. You want your community to be safe. We also want this community to be safe. And even just having that sort of seed of a common ground can be the starting point for a longer-term collaboration. Even if you do it really differently, even if you disagree along the way, I think that sort of very, very basic and very fundamental common ground can really be a fruitful beginning for that kind of work.
Yeah, I see Tim's comment. Would you like to read it, Adam?
Yeah, I'll read it. So Tim says that many believe in military solutions over against the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce. Your work will sound crazy in my context. Do you get that response frequently when you go out talking with people? Like,
so interestingly, it depends on who you're talking to. Communities tend to have a really sort of gut positive reaction, which again doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready to, give up their weapons, but I mean, I've literally had people approach me. We're in the field, we've got our vehicle that says Nonviolent Peaceforce, and I have literally have random people come up and say, what is this? This sounds really exciting. We really need this in our community, without having any background information, just saying, we're really glad you're here. This is what we need. We want you to come in. And these are communities that have been ravaged by war for decades. So the response is really variable. I think people develop, cultures of violence develop. We don't go into a community and say, we want everybody to give up their gun and to stop using violence to protect themselves. That would be absurd and not fair, because people have also developed these mechanisms, and they might work to some degree. What we do is we say, look, here are some things that have worked in other places. Here are some things that other people are doing. Particularly when it's in a country where you're working, and say, well, I used to work in this other state. The community there did this. They developed a patrolling team that went out every morning and patrolled the area around. Would that be something you'd be interested in trying? And so I think, we really try not to frame it as an either or, and not to frame it as our way is better, but as saying, what are some additional things that we can do to support protection, to support community security? Here are some ideas that we have. What do you think? What do you think will work? So I think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, that seems like such a crucial way, going back kind of to Tim's question, a crucial way to build trust in any kind of community. Not to so much say, hey, we've got the answers, but to go in and listen and see what people are dealing with in their everyday lives and work with them, as opposed to imposing something upon them. That to me seems to be a crucial way for building trust, both in context, in family context, and in congregational context too.
It's the only way that it's going to be effective. I mean, in sort of international development and humanitarian work, everybody sort of talks about participatory approaches. Everybody talks about community engagement, and so it's really easy for it to become a buzzword. But in my experience, it's not. We do it because it's important, but we also do it because that's the only way to be effective. Like, if there is no community buy-in, you are not going to have an effective intervention. Like, you're just not. You're not going to have, particularly when we're talking about something as complicated as violence and as complicated as security and protection issues. You're not going to go in with the correct information. You need to know exactly what these people are facing, and they're the ones that have the information that's going to be able to help you do this. And so, it's almost just an efficacy question, where if I decided to come in and do my own thing, it just would fail. And it doesn't mean that we can't bring in other ideas. And again, that's, I think, where a lot of the value of having staff come in from lots of different places. So we have people who have grown up in other conflict zones, and so they come in and they say, well, in my community, this is what we did. Here's an idea. But I think there's a very big distinction between bringing in suggestions or experimenting with new ideas and sort of coming in and saying that we already know what's going to work.
But the only way that you are able to bring in a new idea is by first gaining trust. That's the only way that your idea will be received, is by first.
Absolutely.
And the radical thing about that, especially from, I guess, the context that I experience here, is that you listen to the other person, and while you're listening, you're thinking of a response so that you can have some kind of comeback, some kind of, okay, well, here is the real answer. It's nice to hear what you think, but I'm listening so that I can have a response, which is not really listening.
Right.
And
right.
Trust.
Right. Yeah, so exactly. And I think, and we find, this is something that I often tell my staff, particularly when you go into a new place. If you're an NGO and you come in and you show up and you say, we're going to build schools, everybody's going to be really happy. Like, these are really tangible things. We come in and we have to explain our work, and we have to talk about things we've done in other places, and it often will take a little time. What happens is until you get that action that people really see, sometimes someone depends on the, but most teams will sort of this light bulb moment where something will be effective. You will do an accompaniment of somebody where they hadn't felt safe. You'll have a community security meeting and people will say, we've never talked about these issues as a group before, or you'll, sit down with different members of two clans to talk about their issues, and all of a sudden people in the community will say, oh, okay, now I get it. Like, now I understand why you're here. It's okay that you're not, and then they'll stop asking for schools. They'll stop asking for food because they said, well, we know what you're doing. We know why you're here. These are the things that you can work with us at. And so it can be really difficult at the beginning because you sort of are really putting in that time and effort. But it's once people see that you are able to effectively support them, and there you go.
We have our friend Lisa Hadler is listening to us over the phone. And she has actually texted me over the phone her question. And Leah, it has to do with mimetic theory and if mimetic theory has influenced your work. And I know from our conversation earlier that you have heard of mimetic theory before, but you're not, just a little bit, right? So this might be more of a question for Suzanne. I mean, you can, Leah, certainly speak to this if you'd like. But Suzanne, you have had conversations with other members of Nonviolent Peaceforce, Mel Duncan and Frisch, about mimetic theory. So that might be more of a question for you.
Yeah, Lisa, when I first heard about NP, that was my first question to them too. It's like, you must know about mimetic theory, because the practices that they're using seem to be like derived explicitly from this theory of violence, but they're not explicitly engaging with mimetic theory. They're not theorists. They're practitioners, and as Leah said, it's based on what works. And so I found that so intriguing that this group that is, Mel Duncan, is one of the founders of NP, and I got connected with him through the Meta Center, which was started by Michael Nagler, who is familiar with mimetic theory, very familiar with it. And so that's why I thought, oh, well, they must know. And Michael was on the board of NP. He might still be, I think. I don't know. But anyway, but so Mel Duncan came, I think this all began with just this sort of from the nonviolence of Gandhi and Martin Luther King perspective of saying, how can we go in the hot zone and practice this? And so it was about finding what works. And interestingly, what works resonates so beautifully with mimetic theory that that's sort of why we've been so captivated by your work, because we tend to think about it, and you guys are doing it.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think this is the challenge on both ends of the spectrum, is that for us as practitioners, sometimes it's just an issue of time where it's, we're sort of go, and it's all about staffing and funding and all of these, can I get an airplane to the place I need it to be, and all of these things that we always wish that we had a lot more time to sit down and think about this. And so I think sort of bringing together the sides of the practitioner and the theorist really, because I think that really helps to round out sort of both that. I'm definitely reading more now about
that. Yeah, definitely doing it. I mean, that's sort of why we study the theories. We hope it will influence.
Okay.
So,
okay, I'm just going to call. Can you hear me?
A little connection.
Okay. I'm just going to call a little timeout at the moment because we need to switch. We need to switch computers. This isn't working. Okay, well, we're back. We did a little switching because that other computer has a better connection, and so now we're back. I forget where we were, but all that I remember is Leah was talking, and there was this break. It was breaking up. So
I think I was just saying that I was going to read more about mimetic theory, basically.
Great, awesome.
Well, one of the places that it resonates, Leah, is that mimetic theory talks a lot about escalating violence, that and how violence can start with a misunderstanding,
Mm-hmm.
but then it just escalates till it gets to a point where there's sort of like mutual destruction.
Right.
Becomes the main goal. It's
Right.
just that all I want to do is kill you. I forget what we're fighting about.
Right. Sure.
So I wonder how that, do you do a lot of intervention in preventing escalation?
Yeah. I mean, I think we sort of, depending on the context, but there are definitely some places where we do a lot of work on either intertribal conflict or interclan conflict. So often, sometimes it's about resources. Sometimes it is sort of these histories of cycles that it started 10 years ago when somebody killed somebody and then back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes it's much more concrete. The lines at the water point are too long and we're upset that you're taking all our water. Sometimes, cattle raiding. There's a whole range of things, but I think the concept of sort of interrupting that is really important. And again, we often see our role as being that third party that's sort of just able to say, we don't come in and mediate conflict. So we don't come in and say, well, you use the water point in the morning and you use in the evening. But we would say, can we propose a meeting where everybody sits down and the women of the community talk about how they're going to use this water point? And we've actually had developed specifically a workshop on boreholes and mitigating conflict around boreholes because it's such a common resource issue. So particularly when you have displacement, people move into a new place. Displaced communities are often really struggling for a lot of basic resources, but then those host communities are also burdened resource-wise by new people coming in, and it can exacerbate sort of tribal issues or family issues. So we've actually done a number of these sort of day-long workshops, which are very participatory. So, the idea is that you bring people together, you talk about your issues, and then you really do really concrete problem solving. So maybe the solution is a schedule. Maybe the solution is a water committee that meets once a week. Maybe the solution is greater police presence at the water point. Maybe the solution is NP presence at the water point. There's a sort of, not infinite, but there's so many different solutions. And so, we see our role as, one is getting people to sit down and talk about it as opposed to fighting about it violently. So partly it's the sort of interruption. And is the saying, well, instead of fighting about it, we're going to sit down and talk about this. Let's try to do that. And then part of it is sort of facilitating that space, that physical safe space, as well as the sort of community space to work out solutions.
But how do you get to that point? If people are at the point of fighting about it, then they're at the point of really saying, you have no rights here, that I'm defending my access to this water hole. I mean, it just seems to be that they've staked out territories in which there's no room for compromise. Is that what happens?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, again, ideally, we'd be able to pinpoint these things before they actually erupt. Yeah. And this is a context analysis. This is coming into a community and saying, so we think that this might happen. And this is where sort of our expertise as an organization and as individuals come in. So, and we are often actually that voice in a lot of these contexts where we come in and we say, well, we just want to bring up to everyone that we think there's potential for issues about water, and then 3 months later we say, actually, we think that there's still a potential for issues about water. Because, one thing that Tiffany, who's another nonviolent peace force person, always says is that conflict is predictable. It's very rarely a shock. What the specifics might look like, we can't predict where specifically it happens, who specifically is involved, but there's almost always trends. There's almost always indicators that something is going to happen. There was a small incident, and you say, okay, well, what's that going to do? Is that going to make people more mad? People in this part of town are getting really upset about this. So it's about, again, it's about having those community relationships and about using those to pull in information that we can then analyze and say, you know what, we have a feeling that there's going to be issues at this borehole because for the last 2 weeks, people have been talking about it more and more. There was an argument last week. Logic would indicate that might escalate further. So it's about, it's actually very rare that it is surprising when violence breaks out.
Yeah.
If you're paying attention.
Right. Well,
have you ever felt in any danger
Not really. I mean, I've worked in a number of fairly insecure environments. So I was working in an area that was at risk of aerial bombardment for a while, which is, not really comfortable. And I've worked in areas where there's definitely, generally speaking, a risk of incidents or of attacks or of sort of back and forth crossfire. I think, the key for me, the thing that I use to do that, it is about analysis. It's about understanding where you are and what might happen. It's about listening to people in the community talk about what they're doing. It's about knowing where you're going. It's about having these team discussions and saying, well, there was an incident yesterday, so today, we're actually, well, sometimes it might be there was an incident yesterday, we're actually going to go to this place and check it out. Sometimes it might be we think that there's too high a risk, we're gonna stay away. And so it's about making that risk-benefit analysis on a really daily to hourly basis. So I have had a lot of confidence in our ability as an organization to do that. So there have been some situations where we've removed ourselves. We have relocated teams when the risk has gotten quite high, but there have been, I think, many more situations where we have said, this is the situation, this is the risk, this is how we're going to manage that risk, this is how we're going to try to intervene to support the community amongst this risk, and sort of, it's not black and white. It's sort of about figuring out how, not whether or not it's safe, but how to engage safely. Mm-hmm.
What's your relationship like with, I guess, the military of South Sudan, the police force?
Mm-hmm. So there is quite a bit in the sort of different particular structures, because there's all sorts of different security forces in different places. In general, we have quite positive relationships with the police. The police in, South Sudan obviously is a very new country. It's a very poor country. So a lot of the struggles that institutions like the police have are about resources and sort of training issues. So we do a lot of work with the police because we have the same interests. We're both interested in safety and security. And so that can be a really positive relationship, where if we hear of an incident, we can tell them about it. Sometimes we can go visit together. They hear about something that they think we will be helpful for, they would come and get us, this kind of thing. So that can be quite positive. The military as well, different, whether the military is a conflict party or not changes quite a bit. We spend a lot of time building relationships with all different actors, and so we put in quite a bit of effort. And again, as I was saying before, you can almost always start with that common interest of keeping these people safe and keeping everybody safe in the area. And so, we're usually able to do that. I think it's harder for military actors to understand our work than for civilian actors and then for community actors. So it sometimes takes a little bit longer and takes a little bit more time and energy putting into those relationships. But I think that we've been able to create fairly positive relationships.
Great. Lisa has another question. Has Nonviolent Peaceforce considered going into places in the United States that are violent, places like neighborhoods of Chicago or other cities?
I'm not actually sure, just because I'm not sort of affiliated with that part of the organization that does that kind of project development. So yeah, I don't know. I know there are a number of organizations in the U.S. working on issues of violence. I think they use a sort of slightly different model, but I would imagine that there's probably a lot of similarities in the ways that work. So yeah, I honestly, I don't really know. I think it'd be really interesting to explore, but I know that our work focuses on conflict in a more traditional sense, so really looking at areas where there is war and violent conflict. So I don't think it's necessarily at the top of the priority list, but I think it's always interesting to hear about what other organizations are doing that are similar.
Nice. One of the things that mimetic theory focuses on is the role of religion in these violent conflicts. What do you see as the role of religion in South Sudan, in your experience?
Sure. So it's a fairly religious place, like most places in the world, really. And I think that what I've seen is actually has largely been religion often plays a really positive role in communities, and so we do a lot of work with religious leaders. We do a lot of work with religious representatives of communities, because those are people that communities trust. And so it will often be, when there's a situation of displacement and people have to flee, they'll end up staying in a church, or the pastor will be the one who's organizing the community to respond to whatever it is. So, there's sometimes sort of issues of conflict between different religious groups, but I actually think we see much more positive influence in many ways. The political conflict often uses religion as a way to talk about it, but on a grassroots level, that's not really what you see. What you see is people using religious communities as a community structure that they can use to support themselves. So, I think it varies quite a bit, but that's been a lot of my experience.
South Sudan is primarily Christian?
Mm-hmm. Primarily,
okay.
But not really, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Although there's many sort of different kinds of Christianity there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, nice.
But the conflict isn't primarily a religious conflict. I mean, even though it's divided.
I don't think so. I mean, it's often how it's portrayed, but I think, like most conflicts, I think it is primarily what I would say political in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether that gets talked about in terms of religion or talked about in terms of ethnicity or talked about in terms of language difference, to me, a lot of those things, it's one of the ways that we organize ourselves in communities.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Just one of the many things we can fight about.
Exactly. Yeah. But the fact that so many religious leaders, are involved in these peace efforts, I think, just speaks for itself, really.
Yeah. Can you give us an example or a story just from your experience in South Sudan?
Sure. Anything in particular?
Oh, well, I mean, I was going to ask, like, specifically about, like, a pastor helping out in that kind of way, but I want to keep it very open-ended. Like, is there anything, like a story that has really impacted you, that you experienced in your time there?
I'm sure there's many. I just need to sort of pick one. So, okay, so one sort of intervention that we were working on right before I left was there, in the state that I was working in, many different tribes, a lot of intertribal conflict among other kinds of conflict. But there was a lot of mistrust. The violence had gotten fairly bad. There was quite a bit of mistrust between these different tribes, such that individuals felt very uncomfortable going into areas where the other tribe was, and felt very threatened just by the fact of being in these other areas. So there was quite a bit of violence in one area between a non-state armed actor and the state, which had caused a lot of displacement. So in our site, in the other area, we're seeing displaced people come in who are all sort of centered in this area because it was the only group of that one particular tribe among a larger group of these other tribes that were currently, fighting. So this was a very high tension situation. People felt really uncomfortable. It's not so much that there were direct threats happening every day, but there was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of concern. So we, like I was saying before, this is one of the things that, knowing what we know about the context, knowing what we know about the way that this works, we identified that as a potential risk. We said, okay, this is a community that needs support. We think that we have a role here that we can play. We had been working in all 3 of the major tribal areas of the state very intentionally. That was the way that the project was designed, because we felt and still feel that gives us the broadest amount of accountability and of responsibility to the entire population of this area. So we came in, we had relationships with both of these communities. So we went in, we did a lot of work with this displaced community in terms of just supporting them and accessing services and that kind of thing. But we're also able to, over time, eventually able to help them to build relationships with the communities around them. So the issues that came up, issues of water, this is always a huge thing, sort of, feeling really out of place, everybody knows they're there, all of these things. So we were able to do some workshops specifically on boreholes, which everybody found really, really helpful. But one of the really great things was that we had done a lot of work with the sort of municipal council in this area. So we had really strong relationships there, and we had really strong relationships in this displaced community. And there was one point where the council came to us and they said, look, we want to invite the leader of this IDP community to one of these meetings. Do you think that would be okay? Can we invite him to this meeting so we can talk about these issues? said, that sounds great. So they invited him to this meeting. He came to us and he said, well, you know, can you come with me to this meeting? Like, it's a new thing. He wasn't really sure about it. He knows that we have relationships with that community. He trusts us. He said, great, that sounds great. We'll absolutely accompany you to this meeting. So he and maybe somebody else, they were able to go to the like essentially a municipal board for this town. Was invited to go to this meeting. We were able to sort of introduce him to individual people before the meeting and sort of facilitate that relationship. At the end of this, they actually invited him to become a member of the council, and so he could sort of take part in decision making, which, I mean, it's hard to sort of explain, but given the level of mistrust between these two communities, it was an amazing step. And you know, we went from sort of a month before being really worried that this community was going to become a target of violence to having their leader be accepted onto this council of the town. And this is in an area where this town does not have very many people of this tribe for that very reason. So that was really exciting, and we really felt like that was something that we were able to do because of the relationships that we had built. And so this is you know, the way that we work in terms of trying to build sustainability. So initially, he'll come to us and he'll say, well, this is an issue I want to raise. Can you help me raise it with these people? Our goal is, of course, eventually that he'll be able to go directly to them. And so we really did see that happen over time, that we provide that safety and security, both in a physical sense, but also in a confidence building sense. And then eventually those relationships are built and they'll be able to continue to work on that in the future. So I was really happy about that one.
Wow. Yeah. That is great.
Yeah. And I think, you know, working on a grassroots level, I think, because something that people ask all the time is sort of, we're small in the world, right? We're not the UN. We're not present in 58 countries. And even in the country, we have teams that are based in communities because that's the way that we think is the most effective. So it can feel a bit like, well, we're just doing these baby steps. But I think, you know, you hear things like that, and it's all of these little things that come together that can really create new and different things. And so maybe the next time there's an incident, these people that were involved in this are going to think about it differently. And so I think for me, it's really these things that seem so small can really add up to meaningful change.
Right. And you're right. I mean, you're not in all the places that need you around the world, around the
Not yet.
globe. Exactly. But I mean, one of the things that we're coming near the end of our hour, and I did want to talk about the way NP does get their funding and the ways that support can happen. And one of the things that impresses me is that the work that NP is doing is being recognized by the United Nations, and that Mel Duncan and the leadership at NP is working with the UN to develop training for nonviolent peacekeepers coming out of the UN, which I think is a monumental shift in thinking that's taking place at this international level. And I do know that while NP gets government funding from the local, from the countries that you go to, you do rely on private donations a lot.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I really like is that local groups could sort of like sponsor a peacekeeper and raise some money to, because the civilian peacekeepers, I mean, that's your job. You're not volunteers. You're paid for, you're professional civilian, nonviolent civilian peacekeepers. So we could talk about how do people get recruited to this, what kinds of people are involved, what does it cost to put a peacekeeper in the field, that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, we, you know, function like an NGO. So we hire internationally as well as locally. Our local staff, we usually start by hiring people from the community because that's the best way to get to know what's happening and understand the context, though we also do have national staff that move around to different locations, obviously. With mixed teams, you know, international staff and national staff bring really different and really equally as important aspects to a team, so I think it's really important that we're able to build those mixed teams. Our international staff come from all over the world. You know, I think at one point in South Sudan, we had people from 23 countries, but it changes every time a new person comes or goes. So it's quite a big variety. I mean, one of the really great things about NP actually that I've seen is that we tend to have a lot of people from the other countries that we work in as well. So in South Sudan, we have a number of people of Sri Lankan staff who worked with us in Sri Lanka and then have come out to South Sudan. There's a couple people from the Philippines that work for us in the Philippines that have come out to South Sudan, and hopefully vice versa over the years as well. So I think that that's one thing that's really great, is that we're able to reach people who wouldn't necessarily be applying to a job that's posted online, but who are able to really develop and who are great at what we do because they've seen the impact that it's had in their own community. So we recruit, online. We sort of post jobs like any other organization. We're looking for a really broad variety of things. I mean, I've done a fair amount of recruitment for field staff, and what I always notice as we're hiring people is there's sort of no such thing as a perfect applicant in many ways, because different people bring in such different experience. So we have people with military backgrounds, we have people with sort of humanitarian backgrounds, we have people with peace activist backgrounds, we have people who have medical backgrounds, all sorts of things. And so I think when you put teams together, you're really looking for a mix of attributes. So it's, I've met some really great people. It certainly takes commitment. It's not easy work. You're not living in really nice places, that kind of thing. So it certainly, I think, takes a certain kind of person who's really willing to do that and really willing to commit to that kind of a life. But yeah, so it is, it is a job. We have a lot of staff with families back home who they're supporting. People who go back every 3 months to visit their kids. All sorts of. Also, everybody has a different circumstance, of course.
Yeah.
So it's a really big mix, but it's I think a great group of folks.
And do you know what the costs are associated with, training someone or putting them in the field for a year? I remember Anne gave me these numbers, but I can't remember now.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that they've sort of calculated a number. It's very difficult because all of the sort of costs of, there's so many different costs that go into it, so it'd be very difficult. Our budget in South Sudan, I think, must have been, I'm going to get this wrong, $5 or $6 million, $4 to $6 million for a year of 6 to 8 sites running. So frankly, we're very cheap compared to many other interventions, and definitely compared to any military interventions. That being said, it does require money,
Right. Yes, it's much less expensive to put an unarmed peacekeeper in than it is to put an armed.
Absolutely, dramatically less so.
Yeah, I don't remember the numbers. We'll find them. Ann will send me the numbers.
But it is, I think this is the, fundraising is always a challenge, and the challenge for small organizations as well. So we do rely quite a bit on individual donations as well as the institutional donors. And I think, for me, the thing that's really important is that we are able to sort of support our staff as they do this work.
Yeah.
And that, as a manager, is the most frustrating thing about not having money, or is when we have sort of funding issues. It's not so much like, because it's all staff support. So it's more saying, it's me looking at my teams and saying, they're doing such good work, they're doing such amazing work.
Yeah.
I wish that we could buy them a bigger generator so they can have more electricity as they're doing that work. Or, it'd be really great if we can send them another shipment of food because, they're eating rice and beans every day. So I think for us, the important thing is just to make sure that we are supporting the peacekeepers in the field who are doing the difficult work.
Well, the bottom line is, any amount of donation will be really appreciated.
Absolutely.
But I know at the Nonviolent Peaceforce website, you can find ways to donate.
Yep. And I think maybe they have some of that stuff online.
They do.
Yeah.
I know. X number of dollars will do this.
Right.
That kind of thing is on the website. And so I really strongly encourage congregations to get involved in this, because it's a real concrete way to do nonviolent. Everyone's wanting to have some impact in global situations around the world. You read about the suffering and you want to do something, right? And this is just so concrete and powerful, and it's transformative. It transforms these communities in such a, and it's empowers them and equips them to bring security to their own communities.
Absolutely.
So I
Yeah,
guess
I was gonna go back to Tim's comment, right? I mean, before we let you go, Leah, I want to ask you about this. I mean, Tim said that your work is going to sound crazy to some people because we generally think that violence will bring about peace, but you're bringing in kind of a radically different approach, and I hear a lot of optimism from you about this approach. I mean, you're smiling right now as you're thinking about it. I mean, can you give us a little bit about, I guess, your optimism about the future of this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's so, coming from a practitioner standpoint, it is really difficult sort of for me to think about it in structural ways sometimes, because I always just come back to, well, this one time, this thing happened, and this is why it was really effective, and this is what it did. And so, it's sort of bridging that is, just because I've been in the field for so long, is a little bit difficult for me. But that, like I said, I mean, maybe it is anecdotal and wouldn't stand up to a peer review yet, but I have seen so many success stories, and I think particularly from a community level, seeing the way that communities react to us, like we have had people say to our teams on the ground when violence is escalating and people are fleeing and things are getting really bad, they say, as long as NP is here, we know that things are okay. If NP leaves, that's how we know things are really bad. And that, I mean, it's sort of awful in the sense that sometimes we do have to leave in order to protect the security of our staff, although we do always go back very, very quickly. But I think that sort of the fact that communities who have lived in this much war have confidence in this and have a trust in some of these processes, to me, that's the optimistic thing. So, it's one thing for me to sort of talk about why I believe in it, but, to talk to somebody who has lived their entire life in war, that person is not naive. That person understands better than I ever could the realities of the situation. And it's not black and white. It's not the only thing that is effective. It's not going to bring world peace tomorrow. But I think the fact that members of these communities do trust this and do believe in this and do take part in these processes is the thing that really proves better than anything else that it can be effective.
Excellent. Well, Leah, thank you for being with us and joining us in this wonderful conversation.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.